Melissa Hortman and her husband were beloved. Republicans in our state have come out very strong against this violence. And in fact, Congressman Emmer and I led a bipartisan statement of every single member of our delegation decrying this violence, calling it politically motivated, and saying there's no place for this in our politics. So Senator Lee and I had a good discussion, and I'm very glad he took it down. And I also thank my colleague, Senator Smith, for also speaking out.
That was Amy Klobuchar speaking in the rotunda about her dismay at Republican responses to the slaying of several of her colleagues in the Minnesota State Legislature. And we're going to return to that topic after we go through the news today. But I'm Claire Potter.
I'm Neil J. Young.
And we are just as distressed as Amy Klobuchar is about what has become a gunfighter nation. So let's begin with the news roundup on Wednesday. So depressing, Neil. SCOTUS delivered an unsurprising but distressing decision in United States v. Skirmetti, the constitutional test for a Tennessee state law that bans chemical or physical treatments for minors who seek to transition from one gender to another. It was a 6-3 decision, surprise, surprise. And there's a key point. It does not ban the treatments or procedures. In other words, the law does not ban the treatments or procedures. It only bans them for transition for minors, which is how they got around the Equal Protection Clause. I'm also going to be including for our listeners a response from Samantha Williams, the parent who brought the case. But Neil, what's your response to this?
I mean, I think unsurprising is absolutely right. Nobody was expecting this court to rule differently. I am really struck now the decision is out that this case was pursued at all. And that's not to blame the victims, but it did seem like this was the foregone conclusion of a decision. And so why plaintiffs pursued this, I just am confused about that, Claire. You're right to note that this decision is only, it only addresses, underage minors, right? And their care. But I think a lot of people are understandably concerned about what sort of precedent does this establish upon which further assaults on LGBTQ rights can be developed from this court. And I think, this decision also stands sort of in contrast to a lot of LGBTQ rights successes at the higher court. So, does this mark some sort of turning point? Is it a standalone decision? I don't know. We shall see. What do you think, Claire?
Well, I agree with you, Neil, and I think the vast majority of the world agrees with you that this was not a good case. I guess I have conflicting responses. One is, as Samantha Williams says in her op-ed for the New York Times, that we're linking to what are parents to do?
Right.
They are now on their 4th or 5th state of doing 500-mile round trips to get 6 months of medication, which maintains their daughter's health, but that's not transgender health. And children should have access to health care, and getting it from 4 or 5 states away is not health care. I would also say it matches up with what adult women are dealing with in abortion cases. So there is some convergence there. I would also say that it seems to me that there is a strategy here among Republicans, which is if you're not banning transgender care for adults and you're not banning the drugs for other things, which they haven't. For example, puberty blockers are perfectly legal in Tennessee for precocious puberty, for hirsuteness in girls, for gynecomastia in boys, and so on. And so what the state is targeting is a particular use, and that is well within the healthcare prerogatives of the state to do that. So it was a messy, messy case. And I agree with you that it does lay yet another precedent for attacks on LGBT rights. I also wonder how it is going to mix with some of the speech cases coming forward to the court, First Amendment cases on book bans in
Mm,
schools and public libraries, because these states too can argue we're not actually banning the books, which they're not. They're not like seizing them at the state lines and burning them in piles. They're simply saying they can't be available to school age children, and in some cases to school age children without the permission of their parents. So it is a tricky threading of the needle that is working for Republicans right now.
definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing that well, the part that found most chilling about that parent's op-ed in the Times was also the fears around, um, so Trump this spring likened this treatment for underage children to child abuse. And so
Right.
um, the very, I think, real concerns on the parts of this parents and others like her that, like, what does this mean? And what might it mean? Should I worry about my child being taken away from me? Should I worry about being imprisoned? And I think all of those things are real possibilities. And I kind of can't imagine living under those fears.
Yes, I agree with you completely. And my heart goes out to all of them. I think it also kind of conflicts with a lot of the parents' rights discourse
Yeah.
as well. I mean, these are parents who wish to do the best thing for their children. They wish to have charge over their children's health care. And I had a little scuffle on X with someone in which I brought this up. I said, do you want the state to demand that your child be vaccinated? And the person responded and said, vaccination is not child abuse. This is child abuse. So the language of child abuse
Yeah.
is being deployed over and over again. And I think, and this is sort of the theme of this show, extremism shifts the conversation dramatically.
Well, that's I
So,
think that's really,
yeah,
I just want to say one thing around that because I think that's such a smart
yeah,
point that I hadn't put my finger on. I've thought a lot about the discourse of parental rights because I've written about it a lot in the sort of things I've looked at in the history of conservatism. And, whenever parental rights is invoked, my response has always been, which parents, right?
right,
Because, of course, there are always competing groups of parents who have different objectives, different sort of beliefs, and different ideas about what should happen. But the discourse of parental rights has been this incredibly effective language in American politics to cover a lot of bases and to get a lot of things done around a very particular agenda. But I think what will be really fascinating is if parental rights discourse sort of gives way to the language of child abuse. Much
yeah,
as religious liberty language went away for other sorts of discourses in recent decades, because so much was pointed out that religious liberty wasn't actually being broadly applied, but was like a narrow political agenda. So we shall
right,
see. And
right.
obviously, to invoke child abuse is enormously powerful as well as a scare tactic.
Yeah, it is. It is. All right. So, in more bad news, on Tuesday, New York City Comptroller and mayoral primary candidate Brad Lander became the second Democratic politician detained by ICE as he was escorting an immigrant out of 26 Federal Plaza, which is where a lot of immigration hearings are held. Numerous Democrats, including Governor Kathy Hochul, defended him. Kathy Hochul actually went down to 26 Federal Plaza to retrieve Brad Lander, and she held a press conference in which she announced that his arrest was bullshit. I've never heard Kathy Hochul use that kind of language. And what's also interesting is that Kathy Hochul has now elevated herself by doing this. He's a progressive, she's not. Lander has described what happened to him, which he has done several times before. Apparently, escorting immigrants is a thing. You have someone who is documented, who is a citizen, stay by the person in case something happens. You walk them out of the building and hope that that will shield them from being arrested. But right wing media, of course, went berserk. with many people calling it a campaign stunt. Now, I think it has, in fact, elevated his numbers a little bit, probably because more New Yorkers just know who Brad Lander is. But, Neil, where are we heading with this stuff?
Well, I think we're going to see a lot more of this happening. I think back to Lander, like, I don't think this is at all a campaign stunt on his part. I think this, like, he had been doing this. Yeah, obviously he benefited from this sort of politically, and that his name has been very much in the news. And I think a lot of people, rightly so, in the city are admiring what he's done here. But this is clearly a tactic that the Trump administration is happy to use and will continue to do so.
Right.
Was it Kristi Noem or Pam Bondi? One of the two of them, like, literally said within the last week or so that they are going into Democratic cities to liberate them
Right.
from the
Right.
Democratic politicians. So they've said out loud
Right.
exactly what they're going to do. And that's going to take different forms. And one of them might
Right.
be actually detaining and locking up elected officials.
Right, right, which is ugly. It's very symbolic about what this administration does and does not respect. And I think, part of what's a little scary about it as well is Trump's apparent willingness not just to use this militarized force of ICE and Homeland Security, but his stated intention to put more federal troops in blue cities to make sure this mandate is carried out. And it's something he has, I think, shifted to more strongly after that sort of taco moment where he said, "Oh, everyone in the hospitality industry and the agriculture industry is upset that we're arresting their workers. So we're not going to do that anymore. We're actually just going to turn to the blue states." In fact, Washington is saying they are still arresting people at work sites. But he's pushing himself to make this much more direct attack on blue cities.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it's also interesting that the other mayoral candidates, most prominently Andrew Cuomo, came out against it. So it's something that has kind of unified the Democratic field in a way nothing else has so
Yeah.
far.
Yep.
So we don't normally do foreign policy, Neil. Neither of us are really experts on foreign policy, just intelligent observers. But we can't ignore developments in the Middle East. Right after we broadcast last week, Israel launched a series of air attacks on Iran that decapitated its military leadership, damaged nuclear facilities, and killed at least 2 leading nuclear scientists. The possibility of U.S. involvement, which the president is toying with, he says he's going to make the decision in 2 weeks, has split the MAGA coalition, with many of them urging Trump not to betray his America First pledge to the American people. One of them is Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has loudly opposed intervention. On his X podcast, Tucker Carlson pilloried Ted Cruz and belittled him. Cruz is a traditional GOP Israel hawk. And then there's bipartisan legislation that is making its way through the House and the Senate invoking the War Powers Act. Holy moly, Neil, what is going on here?
A lot's happening. And I think this is a place where you see this sort of loose coalition that Trump was able to tie together, showing, some of its divisions around obviously a big, important issue. And I think that especially to see that America First for a large faction of Trump supporters really is a sort of pure isolationism is fascinating to watch. There's a lot of things to be said here about the sort of different factions and the different folks who are making different cases here. I have to say, I was just in a real pickle watching the Carlson Cruz conversation because, right? Like, it's like feels really weird to be like really thrilled that Tucker Carlson is landing these punches because, Ted Cruz is a very punchable figure, but then you're like, oh, but then this means I'm sort of like cozying up to Tucker Carlson. And it's not necessarily that I even agree with Carlson's position around this at all, but it just feels really good to see someone just eviscerate Cruz, like a smug person like Cruz, you know? Um, I think obviously there's going to be, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to do her stuff on Twitter. Um, the sort of serious minded folks that are writing, you know, isolationist pieces for foreign affairs probably isn't going to have a huge effect. But someone like
Mhm.
Tucker Carlson, I don't know, that feels like it really might have an impact on this. And of course, Trump has no idea what he's doing. The 2 week deadline is just an expression of the fact that he has no position on this to begin with. We shall see.
Yeah, and there was a New York Times piece today that said basically, have you noticed whenever Trump doesn't know what to do, he says he'll decide in 2 weeks. That
That's what I
seems to
mean.
be his that seems to be his unit of time. But let's pretend for a moment that we don't dislike these people so much that we can't look at them objectively. I had two observations. One is that Marjorie Taylor Greene has really matured as a legislator. I don't like her. I don't like what she stands for. I don't like who she is. But she's taking a very, very strong leadership position on an anti war stance for the party that is actually going to push her up the ladder with a certain group, I think. My second response is I liked watching Tucker Carlson pillory Ted Cruz as well. And then I had this thought of like, Tucker Carlson is like a mouthpiece for Vladimir Putin.
Right.
And, you know, it's part of where we've gotten with our media atmosphere and the ways in which enemies of the United States have infiltrated the media atmosphere. I was thinking, am I listening to Tucker Carlson or am I listening to what Tucker Carlson is being paid to say by Vladimir Putin? Which makes me sound like a conspiracy theorist. I know I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but Tucker is awfully cozy with the Russians, and it doesn't really give him much of a platform for being credible on this issue.
Completely so. Even as I think he, you know, one doesn't have to be a Putin puppet to expose Cruz's ignorance around these issues, right? So
Right.
I think that's where it's hard to know, you know, what here is sort of legitimate pushback to
Right.
Cruz, like Cruz not being able to tell you what the population of Iran is, seems like something a senator should know as they're,
Right.
you know, calling for it to be bombed off the face of the earth or whatever.
Right.
And also, Carlson is in the hands of Putin. So it's just a messy
Right.
situation there in assessing things. I want to go back to your point about Green, though, because if you told me 3 years ago that Green would make herself into a more legitimate political candidate and perhaps someone who even has a better chance on the national stage via foreign policy issues, I would have thought
Right.
you're absolutely crazy. And yet it is fascinating that this is the ground upon which I think she's made herself into some sort of she's presented herself in a much more serious form than she has around other issues. And that's, I think, that's a big surprise to me.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think several things have been good for her. One is her very shrewd decision to separate her fate from the fate of Lauren Boebert.
Yes.
She did that about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and Beaubert has almost disappeared from the
Yep.
map, and Green Star has risen. The other thing that I think has been very good for her is to have Matt Gaetz gone. Because she and Gates were really good
Mm,
friends and they worked together a lot. And he's just like a crazy, nasty motherfucker. And so she has actually gained some legitimacy from the absence of these other extreme figures from her orbit.
yeah, that's a great point.
So, Neil, before we go on to our main focus for today, which is the escalating political violence that actually exploded in Minnesota last Saturday, I just do want to add one more news item, which is another one of Elon Musk's rockets blew up, this time on the launching pad in a huge fireball. There was a video of it on the New York Times, and it was, first of all, cool if you like to watch things blow up. But really, it's just sort of like a punctuation mark on Musk's endless failures in 2025.
I didn't know that news. But can you imagine seeing that and then like going out to your garage to get into your Tesla to drive to the supermarket? Like I would like
Or getting in one of Tesla's self-driving cars. Oh no,
even
baby.
worse.
No,
Yeah.
no, 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 no. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's get to our main focus today. Um, Last Saturday, Vance Bolter, a 57-year-old evangelical Christian and registered Republican, executed Democratic Speaker of the Minnesota House, Melissa Hortman, and her husband, Mark. May they rest in peace. And also severely wounded Democratic State Senator John Hoffman and his wife, Yvette. Apparently, it was the Hoffman's daughter who called the police and interrupted this spree. He had apparently been planning the attack for months. It obviously went off on No King's Day, a perfect day to get a platform. He was going to attack some of the No Kings protests in the Twin Cities areas. He left behind a long list of other targets. What is perhaps most chilling about this is that he disguised himself as a policeman. He came to the door dressed as a policeman. Who doesn't open the door for a cop? Neil.
Yeah, I think that that honestly doesn't that scare everyone listening to it because you just imagine yourself being in the same situation.
Right.
And I think it's obviously the fears around that are heightened by the moment we're in which we have, masked authorities pulling people into vans and detaining them and
Yep.
deporting them and all the rest. So there's a moment in which enforcement feels really lawless because of the way in which, and we talked about this, I think, last week, so much of it is being done um, in sort of disguise or under sort of, not open and sort of transparent in the ways that I think we would expect. So that just feels very chilling that he tapped into that as a way to pull this off. And just the sort of trusting nature of any person, especially I think of an elected official going to their door and seeing, a person who seems to be a law enforcement officer, that would be the last thing they would expect.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And you can go online and buy police gear, which
Yeah.
he apparently did. I mean, the first reports that came out said that he was a private security guy and linked him to a couple of companies that seemed to be doing very well. That turned out not to be true, as early reports are often not true nowadays. He was sort of a marginalized figure economically, suffered from depression, it looks like, was a Donald Trump voter, is a registered Republican. Not that that means you're a violent person, right? So there's a certain kind of person who is violent, who is a registered Republican, who then turns to this kind of activity for whatever reason. And that's really something we've got to figure out as a society, Neil.
Absolutely, but also, the immediate rush by so many folks to brand him as a Marxist, and a radical left
Right.
right, and that this is example 1 million of the violence of the left. I mean, that exploded on Twitter. It didn't really make sense given the context of even those early clues we knew about what was happening there. About this character and those folks that were the folks that were murdered and the attempted murders. But yet that narrative took hold really quickly on Twitter, on the right, and being put forward by even someone like Senator Mike Lee from Utah. So these are not just like crazy conspiracy folks in basements, with like Twitter accounts that have 12 followers. This is like even including a U.S. senator putting forth these ideas.
Yeah, Neil, let's talk about Mike Lee for a second. What happened to Mike Lee? I've never liked Mike Lee, but I always thought he's a religious person for one thing. He's a devout Mormon. He seemed to be sort of a garden variety conservative,
Yep.
and he has now seized on this very MAGA style. I mean, even the account that he was tweeting from is called Based Mike Lee.
Yeah.
not Senator Mike Lee or Michael Lee of Utah or something like that. It's this sort of slangy gamer term. What happened to this man?
It was interesting. I was seeing on Twitter someone who said, and I can't remember if it was a political reporter from Utah or just from DC, who's knows Lee well, and basically was like he has been broken by Twitter, like that this guy was sort of self radicalized on social media, and was a different person altogether 10 years ago. Sort of, as you said, a
Right.
garden variety Republican, and who radicalized himself on Twitter because he was in this sort of feedback loop, where what was working to get him the most attention was the most radical, and hateful and ugly stuff that he put forward. And that apparently, like, this person's assessment of him, sort of on a psychological level, was that he's a person who desperately needs approval and needs recognition, and wasn't getting that from sort of, as sort of, unimportant Republican senator, wasn't really getting that from the power players in Washington, but started getting it once he, went in this sort of off kilter direction on Twitter. And I think, like what you said, the Twitter handle is that's the best evidence here. Like that a U.S.
Right.
senator would call himself based as part of his Twitter handle is all we need to know about really what's happened here and who he is.
Yeah, I agree with you. And just to sort of offer some context, as you just did, Neil, I would also wonder if being paired with Mitt Romney had something to do with it. Because Mitt Romney, of course, was sort of more of a centrist Republican for many years. People may recall he was governor of Massachusetts many years ago. He established the healthcare system in Massachusetts that Obamacare was based on. And then, of course, ran for president and failed in 2012 and came back as a senator. So he was the junior senator from Utah, but he was the more senior political figure to Mike Lee. And I wonder whether that kind of dynamic where Lee decided he had to differentiate himself sharply from Romney by becoming this other person. I mean, I guess what I'm asking you is how conscious do we think it is and how unconscious do we think it is?
The differentiation from Romney, I mean, I think it's probably there
Yeah,
a lot, because I also think that this brings out sort of factionalism within Mormonism too. So it's not just Republicanism we're talking about, but
right.
it's also sort of divisions with Mormonism. And I think, Romney represents sort of East Coast establishment, elite Mormonism, which there is a long, robust history of that.
Hmm.
And Lee, first of all, is an incredibly important Mormon last name, almost as important as Young and Smith. So tracing himself
Didn't know
back to,
that.
yeah. So this is like one of those early names that, is has high status in Utah, and certainly would trace you back to the pioneer tradition. Um, but
Right.
also has, from what I understand, Mike Lee himself has sort of operated more in the most right wing factions of Utah Mormonism. And so I think there's sort of multiple things happening here. And it also deserves to be said again, just what an ugly thing he did. And I thought it meant a lot that, and also I think it's telling that the two senators who directly confronted him were both women. But
Yeah.
obviously, I think it's so honorable that they did so. But I do think it's telling that it was two women who actually went to speak to him and to say, this really is beyond the pale. This is in the case of, I think actually both of the women who went to talk to him knew the victims directly and said,
Yes.
what you've done is just disgusting and hurtful, for the families and for all of Minnesotans.
Yeah. And I mean, Minnesota is a huge state, but I think people don't really understand what a small political community it is.
Hmm.
And that's always been true of Minnesota, particularly in what is the Democratic Party there, which is the Farmer Labor Democratic Party. And so the two senators, Amy Klobuchar, former presidential candidate, and Tina Smith, who was originally appointed to replace Al Franken, I believe. Was
Yes,
she not?
that's right.
And then was reelected in her own right. Correct. They did go and face him down. There was actually a picture online of Tina Smith, who looks like maybe she's about 5 feet tall or
Yeah,
something, standing ramrod straight, talking to Mike Lee, and Mike Lee looming over her in this really sort of aggressive, super masculine in not a good way fashion. And Amy Klobuchar, who we heard at the top of the show, also said that the entire Minnesota delegation, Democrats and Republicans, sent a letter to Lee saying that this was unacceptable. So we're seeing a little bit of bipartisanship. People talk about Minnesota nice.
mm,
I don't think it's Minnesota nice. I think it was Minnesota honorable, Minnesota respectable, Minnesota. What the hell happened to our politics?
yeah, for sure.
So, if those senators going to Mike Lee was not enough, today the New York Times delivered a stinging rebuke to Donald Trump for having fomented political violence against politicians in both parties. And basically, the New York Times has said, it isn't just Democrats getting attacked, although Democrats are attacked more, women and people of color are attacked more. But that it's Donald Trump who made political violence acceptable and made it acceptable for other politicians to ignore it, to shrug their shoulders at it. In this case, Donald Trump was on an airplane coming back from the G7, I think, and he first posted a long, rambling repudiation of the violence on Truth Social. And you think, well, it was better than last time.
Yeah.
And then, when asked by a journalist whether he was going to call Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to say, he was so sorry it happened, Trump said no. He said it was a waste of time. And then he went on to insult Tim Walz, who was, of course, the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats in 2024. Neil, why would it be so hard for Donald Trump to express sympathy in a situation like this?
Because he's never done so before in his life. And that is a core human quality that he
Yeah.
does not possess in any measure. So we shouldn't be surprised at this at all. We should say this is just the latest example of something he's shown us over and over again. And also, it's like he has one little piece of information that he gets from the most, right wing media sources that he has, which is that, and this was taking off on Twitter, was that Tim Walz appointed this guy and they were friends, and this is all Tim Walz's fault because
Right.
the killer was on some sort of government council or something that he'd been appointed to by the previous governor, and Walz has had reappointed him in some
Right.
just routine act that one does as a
Right.
governor.
Right.
But of course, this is all getting twisted around, and is just the perfect nugget that Trump needs to sort of validate the decision around here. But all of this boils down to the fact that like Trump possesses no empathy and sees Walz not as another human and the governor of Minnesota, and this is just something that one does in a leadership position, but is his former adversary.
Right, right. And it's really stunning, actually, that someone who has as much media experience as Trump can't even summon an "I'm sorry this happened" in person, speaking extemporaneously. Most of us could do that. Even really horrible people could do that. I remember, and this, of course, takes us back a ways, when Steve Scalise was shot on the baseball field. The congressional baseball teams were practicing, and an anti-Republican guy showed up and started shooting, and Steve Scalise could have died from the injuries he received. And the outpourings of affection and concern from Democrats were overwhelming. we just really didn't see that from Republicans at all. Maybe it wasn't elevated in the media, but I didn't see it on social media. Everybody seemed to be following Trump's lead. What does this do to the Republicans as a party, Neil?
It's so, so toxic. I mean, I don't think we can ever, I don't think there's record of Trump ever saying the words, "I'm sorry," publicly. This is a
Right.
man who, when 9/11 happened and literally the buildings were collapsing on live television, he was interviewed and was talking about himself and, his own, the
Right.
ways he'd been wronged and how he knew things. He has never once expressed any basic human empathy towards others. And that's one thing for it to sort of corrupt his own life and his own relationships, but for that
Right.
to become the spirit and culture of an entire political party as he has more and more influence over the ways in which they act is hugely damaging, not just to the GOP, but to our whole body politic and the way that things operate in this country politically. That folks are scared or they don't believe at all that they can express those things because they too will get the wrath of Trump or Trump's, followers who think that this is now, to express sadness over an American being murdered is to, to be woke or to be soft or to be um, anti-MAGA. It's really ugly what his own ugliness has done to infect an entire party.
I think that's right. And I think there's this sort of crumbling of the MAGA narrative around guns too. I mean,
Mm,
if someone shows up as at your door presenting as a policeman, you don't answer the door armed.
right.
That would actually just be a terrible, terrible idea. I don't even know that much about guns, and I know that that's a terrible idea. So the MAGA narrative that if we were all armed, none of these things would happen is, I mean, none of us really believe that who are not part of the gun lobby, but it's just paper thin,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yep.
So the other thing I just sort of wanted to point to is I sort of feel like so many of these things are happening that there isn't enough time to pause on any of them. And I think that because, first of all, on the same day that the Minnesota legislators were targeted, there were not one, but two shootings in Utah, one at a No Kings protest, in which security people had come to the protest with armed to protect the protesters, then turned around and shot the guy who was shooting. The only person who was killed was actually killed by one of the security people.
Yeah.
And so that's one horrible thing that happened. There was a second shooting in Utah at some kind of festival. A gunman just showed up. And then on Wednesday, the Democratic mayor of Memphis, whose name is Paul Young, Paul Young is not just a Democrat, he is also black, confronted a 25-year-old white man in his yard, a guy who had just like come over the fence and knocked on the door. This guy named Trenton Abston. He was armed with a stun gun, a rope, and a duct tape. Now he said that he was just coming to talk to Young about high crime in the city, but he seems to have come to kidnap him. Um, I just feel we're becoming immune to these things. You see a news item and then you just go on to the next thing when each of them would have just stopped the clock back in 2005.
Completely. I mean, one of the things that deserves to be included in this conversation about political violence is a major event that happened not that long ago, which was the arson attack on Governor Shapiro's, the governor's mansion in Pennsylvania, which was an
Right.
anti-Semitic attack on Governor Shapiro that like was a blip in the news because of course it was being overtaken by every other awful thing that was happening around the same time, and also by a political party that was unwilling to acknowledge it. And so you have like the politicization of something that really shouldn't be as well. So yeah, I think that like this is the way in which Trump flourishes, and of course he's a creator a lot of this chaos. but also benefits from it, because it also just allows so much of a normalization of so many of these awful things, and also the opportunity by which, through which one can sort of expand their authoritarian impulses and projects.
Right. And then, of course, there's the group of people who were getting ready to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan back before the election, right? All right. So there are two things all of these violent activists seem to have in common. One is that they're white, and one is that they are men. And they are not always young men. I mean, people talk about young men being radicalized, but a lot of these guys, Vance Bolter was in his late 50s.
Yeah.
The guy who set off a bomb, a car bomb in Nashville, he was in his 40s, I think. So why are we not talking about white men as a serious problem that we need to address in terms of political violence? Because you don't see women doing this. You don't see gay people going out and
Yeah.
doing this. You don't see, by and large, Democrats doing this. Why are we not talking about that?
Well, I think some of us are, and some of us have been
Mhm.
for a long time. I think historians, especially, have a good scholarly record when it comes to thinking about violence in this country, and that it being overwhelmingly carried out by white men. Um, but that scholarship and that conversation, I think, has gotten so much pushback, not only from the usual suspects, but also has been barely taken up by a media that I think seems really unwilling to engage with this because of their own fears
Mhm.
about bias and double standards and all the rest. And I think that this is one of many topics upon which the so-called liberal media has showed itself to be not very left-leaning at all. But I think that this is one in which, like, the lack of media coverage of and the lack of sort of public conversations around race and gender in this particular realm, um, it's significant that the media has been sort of so unwilling to engage along those lines of analysis.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. And I would also add another thing here, which is the history of white male political violence often implicates women very closely, white women. We see that in the history of the Ku Klux Klan,
Yeah.
in which white men who declare that their purpose is to prevent violence against white women also have women who are, making their outfits, who are cooking for these get togethers and festivals. We see lots of women who are present at these events. We see lots of white women and white children who are present in grisly, horrible photographs of lynchings. What seems to be a little more, or shall we just say different about this, is what we're now seeing is men who are detached somewhat from family, who are detached from community, who have suffered in some way and become economically marginal, who may in fact be mentally ill. And we're seeing less of a presence, an active presence of women supporting political violence. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Apologize for my dog going crazy in the background. He's committing violence on the pool guy who's just trying to make our pool nice. Yes, I think, social
Do you feel
media, like
safe?
with my 12-pound Yorkie going berserk at the door. Um, I've sort of lost the thread of the conversation as I listen to Toby go crazy. But I think, obviously social media drives so much of the atomization here. Um, and I think sort of both empowers and isolates a particular white man towards these actions. Um,
Right.
yeah, and I'll leave it there.
Okay. So just to wrap this up a little bit, Neil, if you were thinking about something that could be done to intervene in political violence, no matter how much it's wishful thinking, What would it be?
Well, I mean, can we imagine a much more restrictive gun legislation passed by this Congress? That seems like it would be hugely helpful. I also think a president speaking out against it carries a lot of weight. I mean, the bully pulpit counts for something, and I think Trump, especially
Mhm.
having such loyal devotion from an enormous base, might actually sway the circumstances. We can imagine that so much of this is happening because of the things he has said and the things he hasn't said. And I think we can also imagine that things might be different if he were to say something definitively around this. So I think a president who spoke up and out against this, especially one like him, could have an impact.
Yep, I agree with you completely. I think the thing I would add to that is I actually think the Republican leadership needs to act in relation to their members and get them to stop tweeting this extremist bullshit. I think Mike Lee should have lost whatever committee assignments he had for a period of time for doing what he did. And I think what is really discouraging is that someone like John Thune, who I actually think is a good person, and he is has a long history of moderation in the Republican Party, um, that John Thune will not discipline his members for tweeting things that are lies, for tweeting things that encourage violence, that Thune will not publicly say to the president, this is not acceptable in our party, and you need to stand up with me and make a statement with the leadership about how much we deplore this and we'll do everything in our power to make it end. I haven't seen Kash Patel out there. Have you?
Right. I mean, Thune, really, I think it's not surprising Kash Patel's not doing anything here, but like Thune, it's such a disappointment, but I also think it also just exemplifies the bind. Well, I was going to say the bind that every Republican leader is in, but that I think lets them off too easy. I think the situation that they've all allowed themselves to be in, which is that they won't stand up at all to the ugly MAGA wing and the MAGA impulses of sort of Trump politics in the GOP, because they don't want to get primaried, they don't want Trump to turn on them and all that. But what kind of leader is not willing to face any of those things? It's just really pathetic.
Yeah,
Why
agree
even be a
with you.
senator? Like, why be a
Pathetic. And
senator?
right, exactly. Well, and if they don't care about this, what they should care about is that every senator and every congressperson is spending a ton of campaign money on extra security. The amount of money that these people are spending on security has escalated dramatically since 2016. I found a list on Vox. Ted Cruz pays $350,000 a year for security. He's at the top of the list. He is the most threatened person. And I guess he must be being threatened by Democrats. I can't imagine why Republicans would threaten him, although he's so unlikable. I guess everybody threatens him. But then the next four are Democrats. Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, I think, is number 5 on the list. She spends over $100,000 a year on security. Cori Bush, again, Black woman, Congresswoman, she spends over $100,000 a year on security. So you would think that at a certain point, party leaders would say, Houston, we have a problem.
Yeah, I didn't know any of that. It's I was going to say shocking to hear, but actually, it's not at all. The Ted Cruz part of it does sort of surprise me. I don't
Right.
know. Maybe in the state of Texas, where you have bigger guns, you have to pay more for these sorts of things. I can imagine him getting threats from the extreme right in his state as well. Who knows? But yeah,
Yeah.
all of this is
Yeah.
terrible, and it's sort of it also I think is telling that they're having to pay for this themselves, right? That this is coming out of their own
Right.
pocket. That the government, the
Right.
Congress hasn't, and maybe there are some sort of protections, a little bit, or some sort of ways in which they're subsidized a little bit around this, but that so much of this is stuff that they're paying for. Um, that was really again, not shocking information to hear, but just, I guess, a sign of our times.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to add a little footnote to that. Ted Cruz is actually much more likable in person than he is when you see him on a screen. I once met him at CPAC and sort of engaged in a little gaggle with him just walking down the hall. And he was actually kind of smart and funny and nice. And I kind of thought, why can't you be like this as a senator? I just want to add a little coda to this conversation, and then we'll move on to our viral moments. But that last year, at least one Republican, Mike Gallagher, may have left his Wisconsin House seat because he feared for the safety of his family. And he basically said, you know, I can walk around wearing a bulletproof vest, but my kids can't. And his home had been targeted so frequently by opponents. And again, I think we have to implicate crazy Democrats in this. He had been targeted so frequently, he just said, this career isn't worth it. And it is a sort of rising conversation. How many people who ought to be in politics are staying out of politics because they don't want to endanger the people they love?
Who would submit themselves to this? I mean, it's not
Yeah.
just those who are going to retire and resign from this. Think of all the people who might, enter politics, but definitely are not going to do
Yeah.
so because of the
Yeah.
ugliness of our political moment, but also the violence of it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's turn to our last segment, which is what we want to go viral this week. Neil, what do you want to go viral this week?
All right. Well, this week I'm not recommending a book. I'm recommending a book review about a book. So there's this big, huge biography that's come out, which hopefully I'll get to at some point this summer. The Sam Tannenhouse biography of William F.
Yes.
Buckley. It's like this huge doorstepper of a book that Sam spent more than 2 decades writing. It's getting all the incredible accolades. I think it's 600, 800 pages. Like, it's an enormous opus. And no, it's over 1,000 pages. My goodness. Um, there's also a much shorter and very brilliant review by our good friend Nicole Hemmer, or as we know her, Nikki, in Democracy Journal. That is just a wonderful overview of the biography. But something that I think is really interesting that she really pulls on from the Tannenhouse biography is like William F. Buckley. A lot of ink has been spilled about him. Like anyone who wrote about the history of conservatism in the last 25 years had Buckley sort of front and center in that. Often as sort of like this respectable, like sort of the respectable example of modern conservatism. And the Tannenhouse biography really focuses in on sort of what a terrible person he was. The sort of terrible politics he has that like a lot of historians have written about, but have sort of soft pedaled or sort of intellectualized away. But also the terrible person that he was and so many of his
Hmm.
like personal relations and his family background. There's some really ugly stuff there with his father. And that this biography really puts that front and center and thinks about why that matters in the politics that he was advancing in this country, and that he had huge influence over the development of modern conservatism. And then Nikki has this wonderful closing section in her review that I think is really worth reading the piece in full for, which says, to its credit, this book ends at the time of William F. Buckley's death in, I believe, 2008, and doesn't sort of make a case for, Buckley as the precursor of Trump or Trumpism, or doesn't like think about Buckley in our moment right now. But she says, and yet it also can be read as a lens through which we might understand this moment and what has come to be. And I think especially what she argues really effectively is a much closer line between the collapse of Cold War conservatism and the rise of Trumpism. So she has some really smart analysis of the biography that lets her say something about our Trump moment, even as she, I think, sort of rightly appreciates the biography for not going there. So I think it's just a really beautiful piece of writing and what reviews should of books really ought to do. And obviously everyone should go read the biography as well, but we'll link to both.
all 1,000 pages of it. But you know what you just said, Neil, makes me want to run down to my local bookstore and buy it immediately. Not only because I actually love a good meaty biography, and I think the last one I read at 1,000 pages was The Power of Adrian Rich. So this will be a very different experience. But you know, just listening to you talk, I was thinking of things that Buckley did that were not immediately successful, but ultimately were the direction for success of the Republican Party. One being Young Americans for Freedom, another being recruiting somebody who was literate on television, Ronald Reagan, who had star power as a political candidate, and then also having the, shall we say, courage or guts or something like that to not care what the Republican Party thought of him, to sort of create this third way for conservatism that wasn't necessarily about electing people, but was about actually changing the ideology of the party, in which he was obviously successful. I have something that's in its own way just as long as what you have suggested with the Buckley biography, which is Ezra Klein's podcast this week with Sarah McBride. The title of it is Sarah McBride on Why the Left Lost Trans Rights. It's 90 minutes long, which is a long listen. Fortunately, I was in the car, but you can also read it in the New York Times. And it elevated my view of Sarah McBride even further than I thought was possible. Sarah McBride is the representative from Delaware. She is the first transgender woman to be elected to the U.S. Congress. She has been the object of endless slings and arrows from the likes of Nancy Mace, who took McBride's arrival as an opportunity to put forward a bill preventing Sarah McBride from using the women's bathroom anywhere in the Capitol. She was supported in this by Speaker Mike Johnson. There have been repeated moments in which she has been deliberately misgendered as she's being introduced to the floor. Her maiden speech on the floor of the House, she was introduced as Mr. McBride. The second time she was misgendered, she then turned around and misgendered the person who had misgendered her, which was sort of hilarious. But what's great about this interview is Sarah McBride speaking to a moment in which trans rights are slipping away rapidly, how scary it is, why she thinks it happens, and what we have to do to move forward again. And McBride's basic approach is that the trans rights people got out over their skis, and that the strategies for them to have watched would have been the civil rights movement, the Black civil rights movement, the gay civil rights movement, the women's movement, in which McBride said, you know, it took decades to change attitudes about all of these groups to a point where it became common sense, say that women were entitled to equal rights, that women are at least theoretically entitled to equal pay, even though they don't really get it, for gay marriage, which has been an active campaign since 1972. So McBride talks about the ways in which trying to push ahead of public opinion is bad political strategy, that it absolutely forces trans people into the position of saying, you know, I have one precious, beautiful life to live, and I'm not going to live it the way I want to live it. And that actually maybe people have to accept that, because in the way things are moving, trans people have not only lost rights, but are the subject of a variety of what you might call information attacks about their personal integrity, about who they are, about whether they exist. And I guess part of what I liked most about this interview is Sarah McBride is both incredibly smart and incredibly humble. And she talks about the painful experience of being hated both by people who know her and people who don't know her. I mean, she talked about coming out as trans to her parents. And she said, you know, when my brother came out as gay, they immediately accepted him. They loved him. They reassured him that they loved him. I knew when I told my parents I was trans, it was not going to be like that. It was going to be a fight. And it wasn't that they didn't love me, it's that they didn't understand and they didn't want this to happen. And I had to fight it out. And she talks about the ways that that trans activists have cultivated a kind of extremism in online culture that has alienated others and failed to engage people. And frankly, Neil, I was surprised that I liked it so much because for most of my life, I have not believed in the politics of incrementalism and moderation. And I think now that Trumpism has pushed us all to such extremes, we need to rethink those strategies. And Sarah McBride really understands how they work. I had one final thought about McBride, which is there's a lot of conversation about the lack of leadership in the Democratic Party. And I think what people mean by that, but do not say explicitly, is that there is not one single leader emerging as the magic person who's going to lead us to the promised land. There's no Obama. There's no, to put it in another vein, Ronald Reagan. There's no Clinton. But in fact, there are a great many younger people who are leaders. And Sarah McBride is one of them. And she has very quickly taken her celebrity and her uniqueness and turned it to a really important microphone for speaking to all of us. And that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening. You can subscribe to Why Now on your favorite podcast platform. Please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, to listen to more episodes, or leave a comment. You can subscribe for free, or you can support my work for as little as $5 a month and get every podcast and every newsletter delivered straight to your desktop. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. And you can follow me on Threads, Blue Sky, or Instagram. Why Now is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers to Political Junkie. Why Now and Political Junkie are written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. My opening theme is by Galaxy News, and my closing theme is by Avocado Junkie. That's all for now. See you next time.